Some mornings begin so quietly, they almost disappear into routine. Cars drift through familiar streets, students move toward classrooms, and coffee shops open without urgency. In late August 2021, Central Illinois looked exactly that ordinary. Nothing felt dangerous. Yet somewhere within those peaceful hours, graduate student Jelani Day vanished, leaving confusion instead of answers behind afterward. His disappearance began without screams, shattered glass, or dramatic witnesses. It started with silence. Phone calls went unanswered, and messages remained unread longer than usual. Family members sensed something was wrong. Human behavior follows invisible patterns, and loved ones notice quickly when those patterns suddenly collapse. Sometimes tiny disruptions reveal disturbing truths hidden beneath ordinary life. At first, investigators faced a familiar possibility. Had Jelani disappeared voluntarily? Adults vanish every year because of stress, depression, financial pressure, or emotional exhaustion. Yet voluntary disappearances usually leave evidence behind, including preparations, hidden plans, or damaged relationships. Jelani's relatives believed something felt profoundly unnatural. They described a man connected to future education ambitions and family. Before continuing deeper into this case, take a moment to support the channel by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Stories like these are not entertainment alone. They reveal how fear, delayed investigations, and unanswered questions destroy certainty. Every unresolved disappearance leaves lasting psychological scars because uncertainty prevents grieving minds from ever fully resting peacefully afterward. Illinois during late summer 2021 carried an atmosphere of cautious recovery. After months shaped by pandemic isolation and anxiety, universities reopened gradually, traffic returned, and students rebuilt interrupted routines. Communities around Bloomington and Normal appeared calm again. Nothing seemed unusual, yet within days, national attention would focus intensely upon a missing graduate student whose disappearance exposed deeper questions involving race and institutional response. The town surrounding Illinois State University did not resemble the setting of a notorious crime story. Streets stayed quiet, neighborhoods appeared stable, and violent incidents remained uncommon. Communities like this create a dangerous illusion of safety. Residents assume violence belongs elsewhere, yet criminal psychology repeatedly shows hidden crises rarely announce themselves publicly before tragedy emerges from ordinary environments unexpectedly later. Jelani Day was 25 years old and pursuing graduate studies in speech pathology. Friends described him as intelligent, expressive, and socially connected. He cared about appearance, communicated frequently, and maintained strong family relationships. Psychologically, that mattered. Sudden disappearance without explanation becomes statistically less common among individuals deeply connected to supportive social environments and long-term professional ambitions. Those closest to Jelani Day often described his warmth, confidence, and outgoing personality. He enjoyed fashion, conversation, and staying socially connected. Extroverted individuals leave noticeable behavioral patterns behind, making sudden silence especially alarming. Family members quickly sensed this was not someone quietly abandoning ordinary life voluntarily without warning or explanation anyone around him beforehand. Cases involving unexplained disappearances reveal another uncomfortable reality. The first 48 hours often shape investigative momentum permanently. Families experience urgency emotionally, while institutions process urgency procedurally. That difference creates immediate tension. Relatives later criticized authorities for responding too slowly, and whether justified or not, that perception intensified distrust and suspicion, surrounding every delayed answer afterward publicly everywhere. At the center of growing pressure stood Carmen Boldenday. Throughout the investigation, she became more than a grieving mother. She became a relentless advocate demanding visibility for her son's case. Trauma often transforms relatives this way. When institutions appear unresponsive, grief evolves into activism. The search for truth becomes inseparable from forcing society to acknowledge the missing person publicly. Friends later described subtle behavioral changes before Jelani Day disappeared, remembering moments where he seemed distracted or emotionally unsettled. Investigators study details like these carefully because psychological vulnerability can sometimes appear before tragedy. Yet hindsight often transforms ordinary stress into hidden warning signs. Once someone vanishes, delayed messages, unusual behavior, and fragmented memories suddenly acquire darker meanings because uncertainty demands explanations the human mind desperately struggles to create afterward. Another layer complicated the investigation almost immediately. Many observers believed media coverage surrounding Jelani's disappearance lacked urgency compared with similar cases involving white victims. The criticism reflected broader conversations already unfolding throughout America. Families of missing black individuals frequently argued their loved ones received reduced attention and empathy. Perceived inequality intensifies trauma because relatives begin fighting society while simultaneously searching desperately for answers themselves. From a criminological perspective, public attention strongly shapes investigations. Media pressure sustains urgency, generates tips, and increases accountability within law enforcement. Carmen Bolden Day understood this instinctively and continued speaking publicly because silence can become dangerous. As August turned toward September, fear deepened around Jelani's family. Every unanswered call weakened hope further, trapping loved ones between desperate optimism and the growing terror that tragedy had already occurred unseen. The environment surrounding the case remained deceptively calm throughout those early weeks. Students attended classes normally, businesses stayed open, and traffic continued beneath late summer sunlight. Yet beneath ordinary routines existed growing awareness that something deeply unsettling had entered this quiet Illinois community. A young graduate student with ambitions and strong family ties had vanished almost completely without leaving clear explanations behind afterward. No evidence pointed clearly toward accident, suicide, or homicide. Investigators faced fragments, scattered observations, and unanswered questions. Uncertainty spread through relatives, authorities, and strangers following the case online. Behavioral experts describe disappearances as mirrors reflecting collective fears because unexplained absence threatens the comforting illusion that ordinary life always remains predictable, controllable, and emotionally secure for everyone. Jelani's story resonated deeply because it lacked clarity. There was no immediate suspect, no definitive crime scene, and no obvious motive guiding investigators toward certainty. Instead, there was only a graduate student slowly swallowed by unanswered questions. Psychologically, invisible dangers disturb people more than visible threats because uncertainty prevents the mind from reaching stable emotional conclusions afterward completely. Somewhere beyond unanswered calls and quiet Illinois roads, a truth remained hidden beneath silence. In cases like this, secrets rarely disappear completely. They survive inside overlooked details, delayed reactions, fractured memories, and unexplained behavior. Darkness never destroys truth permanently. It only conceals it temporarily, because eventually every hidden shape reveals itself to somebody watching carefully enough afterward eventually. On August 24, 2021, Jelani Day's final confirmed movements unfolded quietly across Bloomington, Illinois. Nothing initially appeared catastrophic. Streets remained active, students prepared for classes, and ordinary routines continued uninterrupted. Yet investigators would later revisit every minute, attempting to reconstruct a timeline fractured by missing information, inconsistent observations, and silence no witness could completely explain afterward publicly. Surveillance footage later showed Jelani visiting a local cannabis dispensary. Employees noticed behavior they described as unusual or disoriented. Visible confusion before disappearance may reflect emotional distress, psychological crisis, exhaustion, intoxication, or fear. The challenge for investigators lies separating meaningful behavioral indicators from assumptions formed later. Human memory changes dramatically once tragedy reshapes ordinary moments. Video recordings captured Jelani moving slowly through the dispensary, appearing detached from his surroundings. Some observers believed he looked frightened. Others thought he seemed distracted or mentally overwhelmed. Behavioral interpretation becomes dangerous when evidence remains incomplete. People instinctively impose narratives onto ambiguity. In unresolved investigations, uncertainty invites projection, causing every movement suddenly to appear symbolic. After leaving the dispensary, Jelani drove away in his white Chrysler 300. That vehicle would become one of the investigation's most haunting elements. Cars often function psychologically as extensions of routine, carrying traces of intention and movement. When abandoned unexpectedly, they create immediate tension. Transportation rarely disappears voluntarily alongside stable future plans, emotional connections, and ordinary communication habits without explanation afterward completely. The hours following his departure remained deeply fragmented. Family members continued trying unsuccessfully to contact him as calls went unanswered. Every passing hour intensified anxiety among relatives already sensing something profoundly abnormal had occurred. In missing person investigations, silence itself becomes evidence. People maintain invisible communication patterns, especially with those emotionally closest to them afterward naturally. Behavioral analysts frequently examine emotional conditions during final confirmed sightings. Yet one major problem existed within Jelani's case. Observers noticed signs of distress, but nobody understood their origin completely. Distress alone cannot explain disappearance because countless individuals experience emotional instability without fatal outcomes. The terrifying question remains simple: was Jelani alone with his thoughts, or was another unseen influence already shaping events nearby? 2 days later, investigators located Jelani's white Chrysler near a wooded area in Peru, Illinois, roughly 60 miles from Bloomington. The discovery shifted the emotional gravity of the case immediately. Abandoned vehicles create psychological shock because they represent interrupted movement. Something caused the journey to stop unexpectedly. Families often describe discoveries like these as moments where hope weakens visibly and dread slowly replaces optimism afterward. The vehicle itself raised disturbing additional questions. Personal belongings connected to Jelani appeared scattered nearby, including clothing discovered outside the car. Investigators struggled determining whether these details reflected confusion, voluntary behavior, environmental disruption, or foul play. In criminology, disorder within a scene can mislead investigators because chaos sometimes reflects panic while other times conceals intentional staging. One particularly unsettling detail involved discarded clothing discovered near Jelani Day's abandoned vehicle. Clothing carries identity psychologically, causing observers to search instinctively for hidden meaning when garments appear separated from someone unexpectedly. Yet behavioral experts caution against assumptions. Medical crises, psychological episodes, intoxication, environmental exposure, or coercion may produce similar scenes afterward entirely. The wooded environment surrounding the abandoned Chrysler complicated search efforts significantly. Dense vegetation, uneven terrain, and nearby waterways created countless concealed spaces. Environmental conditions quietly destroy information during investigations. Rainfall removes traces. Heat accelerates decomposition. Water distorts timelines. By the time authorities intensified searches, crucial forensic opportunities may already have vanished permanently beneath environmental exposure afterward entirely. Days passed without meaningful answers. For the Day family, the psychological burden became increasingly unbearable. Ambiguous disappearance creates unique trauma because loved ones remain suspended between contradictory realities. One possibility suggests survival, while another suggests irreversible tragedy. The mind attempts holding both simultaneously, creating emotional exhaustion that rarely fades completely. Carmen Boldenday continued urging authorities publicly not to overlook her son. On September 4, 2021, search efforts reached a devastating turning point. Authorities discovered a decomposed body floating in the Illinois River near Peru. Recovery teams immediately understood identification would not occur quickly because of the remains condition. Forensic delays often deepen suffering because emotional closure depends upon certainty. Until identification becomes official, grief remains trapped painfully inside unresolved ambiguity afterward completely. The discovery intensified scrutiny surrounding the investigation. Many observers questioned why identification required so much time despite the existence of a known missing person connected closely to the area. From a forensic perspective, water exposure and decomposition complicate identification significantly. Yet public psychology rarely responds patiently during emotionally charged cases. Once trust weakens, every procedural obstacle begins appearing suspicious or potentially negligent afterward publicly. While awaiting official DNA confirmation, the Day family endured weeks of emotional paralysis. Psychological studies involving ambiguous loss demonstrate unresolved waiting often inflicts deeper trauma. The human mind struggles functioning without conclusion because it continues searching obsessively for alternate possibilities. Carmen Boldenday repeatedly insisted publicly that her son's disappearance deserved immediate national attention. Another troubling reality haunted investigators throughout this period. Nobody could fully account for Jelani's final hours. There were no reliable witnesses documenting his movements after Bloomington. No confirmed interactions explained why he traveled toward Peru. No evidence established whether he entered the river willingly, accidentally, or through force. In criminal investigations, absence itself becomes psychologically oppressive for investigators and grieving families afterward entirely. Public attention intensified as online communities dissected every available detail surrounding the case. Some theories focused on mental health struggles, while others suggested opportunistic violence, accidental overdose, or hidden encounters never publicly documented. Digital true crime culture magnifies unresolved investigations. Because uncertainty invites collective interpretation, fragmented evidence rarely creates clarity and instead fuels endless competing narratives online, afterward, everywhere continuously. Eventually, forensic testing confirmed the body recovered from the Illinois River belonged to Jelani Day. The announcement devastated relatives. While failing to answer the central mystery, identification closed one painful question while opening another far darker one. What truly happened during those missing days? Without definitive explanation, emotional finality arrived without psychological resolution for investigators, grieving relatives, and observers nationwide, afterward completely. Autopsy findings deepened uncertainty further. Authorities could not determine an official cause of death, leaving unanswered whether Jelani Day died accidentally, intentionally, or through criminal involvement. Every confirmed fact remained surrounded by uncertainty, and as searchlights illuminated riverbanks and wooded terrain, the darkness surrounding his final movements only seemed heavier afterward, still everywhere. After the discovery in the Illinois River, investigators returned repeatedly to surrounding areas searching for overlooked evidence. By then, nature had already altered the scene significantly. Water exposure, changing temperatures, and passing time complicated forensic reconstruction. In criminal investigations, evidence rarely disappears suddenly. Instead, certainty fades gradually beneath environmental conditions, until recovery becomes nearly impossible. Authorities attempted rebuilding Jelani Day's final movements through surveillance footage, digital records, and witness statements. Yet the timeline remained fragmented. Large sections of his final days could not be verified completely. Human beings instinctively seek continuity, and when timelines collapse into gaps, fear and suspicion naturally expand beyond available evidence afterward publicly everywhere too. Investigators faced another challenge common in unresolved disappearances. Every theory required assumptions unsupported by direct proof. If Jelani Day experienced psychological crisis, evidence could not explain how events escalated toward death. If another person became involved, no forensic trail identified them clearly. Investigators remained trapped between competing possibilities afterward nationwide, everywhere. As news coverage expanded, the case evolved beyond a local investigation into a national conversation. Social media users, journalists, and true crime audiences followed developments closely while demanding faster action publicly. Many people no longer viewed it as one disappearance alone, but as evidence of broader institutional failures involving visibility, empathy, and investigative urgency. A recurring criticism focused upon racial disparities in missing persons coverage. Many observers argued cases involving missing black individuals often received less national attention than similar cases involving white victims. The phrase, "missing white woman syndrome," resurfaced repeatedly during discussions surrounding Jelani's disappearance. Perceived inequality intensified trauma because grieving families also felt forced to fight invisibility publicly. For Carmen Bolden Day, public advocacy became essential rather than optional. She appeared across interviews and broadcasts demanding accountability from investigators and media organizations alike. Psychologically, activism often becomes a survival mechanism for grieving families, because action temporarily protects the mind from helplessness. Yet every appearance also forced her repeatedly back into painful unanswered questions. Meanwhile, online speculation expanded aggressively across forums and social platforms. Amateur investigators analyzed surveillance footage searching for hidden clues, while constructing competing theories surrounding Jelani's disappearance. Some focused upon possible psychological instability, while others believed another person exploited his vulnerable condition. Unfortunately, unresolved investigations usually generate deeper contradictions and stronger emotional polarization online. One disturbing possibility continued haunting investigators publicly. If Jelani Day appeared visibly confused during his final hours, could someone dangerous have recognized his vulnerability? Opportunistic offenders often target emotionally distressed individuals because vulnerability reduces resistance significantly. Yet authorities never identified evidence directly connecting another person to his disappearance. The absence of suspects intensified frustration surrounding the investigation. Society feels more comfortable confronting evil when evil possesses a face, motive, and understandable narrative. Jelani's case offered none. There were no arrests or revelations exposing hidden enemies. Instead, uncertainty lingered everywhere, leaving fear disconnected from any identifiable source afterward permanently for everyone involved emotionally too. As investigators explored Jelani's personal history, reports emerged suggesting possible emotional strain before his disappearance. Some witnesses described moments where he appeared unsettled or detached emotionally. Behavioral analysts considered whether stress or exhaustion influenced his actions during those final days. However, psychological distress alone cannot explain every unexplained death without additional evidence supporting broader conclusions afterward publicly everywhere to nationwide. Family members strongly resisted explanations focusing exclusively upon psychological crisis. They acknowledged unusual behavior while insisting those details failed explaining the larger mystery surrounding Jelani's disappearance and death. Vulnerability may increase danger, but vulnerability alone does not explain fatal outcomes automatically. Families feared crucial questions about Jelani's final encounters might never receive adequate investigative scrutiny afterward from authorities publicly involved everywhere too. The confirmed DNA identification marked a devastating emotional threshold. Until then, uncertainty allowed relatives preserving fragments of hope, however unrealistic. Once authorities confirmed the recovered body belonged to Jelani, that hope disappeared permanently. Yet psychologically, confirmation solved almost nothing because grief requires explanation as much as certainty afterward for grieving families entirely everywhere too. Autopsy findings intensified ambiguity surrounding the investigation further. Officials could not determine a definitive cause of death because decomposition and environmental exposure complicated forensic analysis significantly. Scientifically, such outcomes are not uncommon during water recovery cases. Emotionally, however, indeterminate conclusions feel unbearable because uncertainty prevents stable emotional resolution from forming naturally afterward for grieving relatives entirely everywhere to nationwide. The public interpreted forensic uncertainty through competing perspectives. Some believed investigators overlooked evidence or failed pursuing important leads aggressively enough. Others viewed the absence of conclusions as proof no crime occurred. In reality, forensic silence often reflects limitation rather than certainty. Degraded evidence cannot always provide coherent answers, even during investigations receiving extensive national attention afterward everywhere to publicly nationwide. Psychologically, unresolved cases create lasting obsession because they resist narrative closure entirely. Human beings instinctively search for motives and understandable explanations whenever tragedy occurs unexpectedly. When evidence cannot support stable conclusions, people revisit details, repeatedly searching for hidden meaning. That explains why Jelani's story remained emotionally powerful long afterward nationwide. Perhaps that is why cases like this linger heavily within public memory. The most frightening truths are not always visible immediately. Sometimes they survive quietly inside missing timelines, damaged evidence, delayed responses, and contradictory interpretations. Investigators search for facts, families search for peace, and audiences search for meaning while truth remains concealed somewhere beneath silence, afterward forever completely. Long after headlines faded, the case of Jelani continued lingering within public consciousness because it resisted certainty entirely. Human beings tolerate painful truths more easily than unanswered mysteries. When explanations remain incomplete, the mind compulsively searches for hidden meaning. Unresolved disappearances therefore become psychologically haunting long afterward for grieving families everywhere. One prevailing theory suggests Jelani experienced severe psychological or emotional crisis during his final days. Supporters reference reports describing confusion, disorientation, and unusual behavior before his disappearance. Clinically, acute psychological episodes can distort judgment dramatically. Individuals experiencing emotional collapse sometimes isolate themselves or behave irrationally. Yet psychological explanations rarely satisfy families confronting unexplained deaths completely. Emotional distress may explain vulnerability, but not every circumstance. Why did Jelani travel toward Peru? Belongings discovered outside the vehicle? Why did the timeline remain fragmented? Investigations become dangerous when theories simplify human complexity prematurely. Another theory remains equally disturbing psychologically. Some observers believe Jelani encountered another person while vulnerable and disoriented. Criminology recognizes opportunistic violence often emerges unpredictably instead of through elaborate planning. Predators sometimes recognize weakness instinctively. A confused individual alone within isolated surroundings can become an easy target unexpectedly without warning signs. This theory gains emotional traction because it reflects deeper societal fears directly. People want believing danger announces itself clearly. Opportunistic violence destroys that illusion completely. It suggests catastrophe may emerge suddenly from ordinary circumstances, without preparation. Yet investigators never identified evidence conclusively establishing criminal involvement. Both theories contain fragments of psychological plausibility, while failing explaining the entire narrative completely. That contradiction defines the emotional core surrounding unresolved investigations. Human beings prefer coherence and understandable outcomes psychologically. Jelani's case resisted that structure entirely. Every explanation answered one question while creating another, leaving uncertainty itself dominating the entire story. Cases lacking definitive conclusions often affect families differently than solved crimes psychologically. Grief normally progresses toward acceptance once reality becomes undeniable. Ambiguous loss interrupts that process permanently. Families remain suspended between mourning and searching simultaneously. Carmen Boldenday repeatedly emphasized this burden publicly because unanswered questions continually reopened emotional wounds across passing years. Psychologists studying unresolved disappearances describe uncertainty as invisible captivity emotionally. Families become trapped inside repetitive thought patterns, searching endlessly for overlooked details or hidden explanations. Every inconsistency suddenly feels important. Over time, resolved trauma reshapes emotional identity itself completely. People stop asking whether tragedy occurred and instead ask whether truth will ever emerge fully. Public fascination with unresolved cases also reveals uncomfortable truths about collective psychology. Audiences return repeatedly to mysteries because uncertainty activates emotional participation directly. People imagine themselves inside the victim's final moments, attempting mentally solving what investigators could not. Jelani's story resonated deeply because it exposed how fragile certainty becomes whenever evidence cannot answer fundamental questions clearly. From an Eastern philosophical perspective, unresolved crimes often carry another dimension entirely. Many traditions emphasize human actions leave invisible consequences, extending beyond immediate circumstances. Even when legal systems fail reaching conclusions, moral imbalance eventually demands correction somehow. Karma reflects psychological reassurance as much as spiritual belief, suggesting hidden truths continue existing beneath silence. Western perspectives often approach cases like Jelani's differently psychologically. Rather than emphasizing cosmic balance, they examine darker aspects of human nature directly. Philosophers and criminologists have long argued ordinary individuals possess hidden capacities for cruelty, selfishness, and emotional detachment. Moments involving vulnerability or opportunity may suddenly expose those instincts beneath ordinary social behavior. At the same time, unresolved disappearances also reveal limitations within institutional systems designed creating certainty. Investigators depend upon evidence, witness cooperation, timelines, and forensic clarity. When those elements disappear, even skilled professionals encounter barriers impossible overcoming completely. Public frustration often interprets unsolved cases as failure alone, though reality itself sometimes becomes fragmented beyond recovery. For those closest to Jelani, philosophical interpretation offers limited emotional comfort ultimately. Behind every theory remains the absence of a young man whose future once appeared stable and promising ahead. He studied speech pathology, maintained strong family relationships, and carried ambitions beyond graduate school. Those personal details resist reducing him into abstract mystery alone permanently. Too often, unresolved investigations transform victims into symbols while obscuring their humanity completely. Jelani Day was not merely evidence within a case file or discussion topic online. He was a person whose life ended unexpectedly, beneath circumstances investigators still cannot fully explain. And perhaps that lingering uncertainty remains the most haunting element surrounding the story even today. Years later, the emotional atmosphere surrounding Jelani Day's investigation remains largely unchanged. No definitive suspect emerged, and no forensic breakthrough transformed uncertainty into clarity. Some observers believe another individual played a role, while others suspect psychological collapse. Neither explanation fully resolves the contradictions scattered throughout the timeline. Criminal investigations often promise closure, yet closure itself may partly be illusionary. Even solved cases rarely explain every emotional contradiction. Unresolved cases simply expose that limitation more openly. Jelani Day's disappearance forced investigators, relatives, and audiences confronting the uncomfortable reality that some truths remain permanently incomplete. Perhaps the most unsettling element within the story is how ordinary everything appeared before the disappearance occurred. No dramatic confrontation announced danger, and no warning sign predicted catastrophe. One ordinary week dissolved gradually into confusion, fear, and irreversible loss. Sometimes lives disappear silently between familiar routines, while everyone nearby still believes normality safely exists around them. And somewhere within the silence surrounding Jelani Day, the unanswered questions remain suspended between competing realities. Accident or intention, crisis or violence, isolation or unseen encounter. The investigation closed certain doors while leaving others permanently open. Perhaps that uncertainty is the true legacy of this case. Some crimes leave no screams, only questions, and some silences echo louder than any confession. Thank you for listening to Criminal Mindcast.